live. Good evening, everyone. Hope everyone is having a good. What day is it? Wednesday night? Short work week has made me forget what day it is. But we are on to instruction booklet number 2 with the castle build. Completed the first half of the building on the last stream. So we're ready to get into the next half. The camera back a little bit again. Get it properly offset again. I think I messed with it a little bit. There we go. Ready to get started building. This will be the last stream of the week because the next couple days are going to be very busy. But then I'll get into doing more next week. I'll actually try to do some daytime streams as well. So that's one of the goals. Making dinner, pan-fried fish. That sounds like a good dinner. Fish is one of those foods that when I really, really am craving it, it is exactly what I want. And then when I am not specifically craving fish, it does not matter how good it is, I probably wouldn't find it very appetizing. But there are a couple of fish dishes that I'd probably eat just about any time. My wife and I discovered it's a recipe for cod, and it's cooked with a succotash as a side with pickled grapes. And all of that, I'm sure, sounds very strange, but it's actually incredibly good. Pickled grapes was never a thing I'd ever heard of or would have ever considered as an actual food thing, but it is actually really good, and it's really very easy to do as well. So yeah, one of my all-time favorite dinners, actually. We discovered it doing one of those Blue Apron type, meal delivery things as a way to discover new foods, try different things, and have some unique recipes. We actually discovered quite a few of some of our favorite dinners through some of those things. Between the cod with pickled grapes and which again, I know it sounds weird, but it's very good, and the tteokbokki, or tok, Tteok, which is a Korean rice cake. Those are some of my favorite things now. But I also just like a standard good fried fish as well. Fish, broccoli, and red potatoes, I assume, is what the tat is, but I don't know. Will assume it is the shorthand we're using. Again, sounds like a good meal. Building an interesting little rock formation here, it looks like. Instructions broke my brain there for a moment. I was doing everything wrong. Wyoming, I assume that you hunt more than likely. Kind of curious, what's your favorite wild game? Because around here where I live, it's all deer. Like, deer is the primary wild game in terms of what people will actually, use the meat for. I think you probably have more options up where you are. Yeah, to eat, primarily. I don't know, maybe you have a favorite wild game to hunt that you choose not to eat, but I meant more as food. Elk, yeah. I've heard elk is very, very good. I've only ever really had elk jerky, which it's good. It doesn't seem too different from beef jerky, really, in my experience. I've never actually had like actual elk meat that isn't, dehydrated and all the rest. But I do hear good things about elk. Seems to be actually a lot of people who hunt outside of my area tend to really like it. Because I'm not particularly a huge fan of deer meat. I find it to be a little bit too gamey, is the word I use for it, although that's not very descriptive. And it's okay in like a chili. Deer chili is probably the most common use I think there is. But beyond that, not my favorite. You get a little bit further south of where I live and you can start getting alligator, I suppose. Got a little bit of the moat piece here. Using up some of these bricks that came very early on. Venison is good if done right. Adrenaline will ruin the taste, so kill it the first shot without... Yeah. I imagine that's got to be true for pretty much everything. There's so many reasons to make sure it's done in the first shot. Reduce suffering. Don't have to try to go find the thing. Don't ruin the meat. All the rest. I'm not an avid hunter or anything. Most hunting I've actually ever done was with falcons. And they weren't even my birds. I was just tagging along. Yeah, I think a lot of deer hunting in my area is mostly done for sport, less so for meat. But there are plenty of people who actually, do it for meat. We have a rather large cottage industry near where I live for deer processing when the season is on. So it's definitely common, but I think most people just kind of use it to fill out their chest freezers next to their steaks and may or may not actually use all of it all the time. And when they do, it's likely for chili or jerky. And I will say that deer jerky is okay. I've found that okay. But I really think almost any type of jerky is actually pretty good. I think tonight is probably going to be a one bag night with a little bit of hanging out afterwards. Probably won't dig into the next bag. I do have a work related stuff in the morning. I'm going to try to get additional sleep so I can be ready for a rather busy day. Chance of you hitting an animal with a car is high enough you almost don't have to hunt. Yeah, I feel like I've actually seen less deer in my area over the past couple of years. I'm not sure what it is, but I definitely do feel a distinct lack of them. The last time I actually saw a bunch of deer, close enough to be concerning on the road, was at 2 o'clock in the morning. When I had to do a through the night trip from Florida back home to where I live in Georgia. And it was about 2 a.m. when I was about to get home. And it was about 30 minutes away and I saw some deer. And that was a few years ago. I've actually seen a lot less these days. I'm not really sure what's up with that, to be honest. Definitely around here, always drive with a keen eye towards the wood line to make sure you're not going to hit anything that's going to come running out at you. Here you have 1 in 57 chance to hit wildlife. Just a lot more wildlife where you live as well, though, right? I mean, like I live in a pretty rural area, and I think certainly if I were to go 10 minutes outside of the city I'm in for the most part, and I mean, the word city is very loosely applied to where I live, but you know, I go 10 minutes out of there, I'm going to hit all sorts of things. Rabbits and possums and maybe deer, but most things will be small animals that come darting out at the last possible second. But nothing big, right? There just aren't a lot of large wildlife animals that are, besides deer, that are really all that concerning. Armadillos are actually the biggest nuisance to that end these days. And they didn't used to be in Georgia, but they slowly migrated over the course of many decades up towards where I live, and now they're actually pretty common, and they like to wreck the landscape and dig holes everywhere. So they're a nuisance that happy to get rid of. Honestly, I think most people are happy when they get them, but they you'll come across them a lot on the side of the road. Number one hit there is antelope. Yeah, you just have a lot of the larger field and grazing type animals, I suppose. All right. This is going to give me a rough idea of how large the base of this entire castle is going to end up being, I think. The entire footprint. You have so many deer, you're going to have to just start killing them off soon. No one hunts them because of chronic wasting diseases that run rampant in them. Huh. Yeah. And I suppose a lot of people up there aren't as interested in hunting for sport, I guess. I mean, you'd assume that if it was essentially open season all the time, people would do it more just as the activity. Is that not the case? I'm not quite sure how hunting licensing and all that works out there. For sport, it's moose, lion, bear, etc. I guess that's fair enough. But are there not limits on those? Like if someone has gone out and they've hit their limit of moose, lion, bears, etc., and they just still want to go out and hunt, would they not go for a large point deer or something? Tag draws only so many per year. So I know that in Georgia everything is about population control ultimately. If people aren't hunting as much or if the deer population is spiking, they'll get more tags to go basically. But by the way, Wyoming, I don't know if it would be in your interest range. A television show that you might like that's a little bit of a different recommendation for me. And I don't know how much you're into British television, but for someone who I'm sure is an expert in self-sufficiency, if you've never seen the British comedy Good Neighbors, it might be worth a watch if you're into that kind of thing. I don't know why that came to mind, but it seems like that's something you might actually enjoy just because it is a comedy, but it's also from the 70s, so it's a little bit dated. One of my all-time favorite television shows, though, personally. I think the actual British title for it was The Good Life as well. Some of your favorite shows are The Red Green Show and The British IT Crowd. Well, there you go. Definitely then look up, because British humor and that kind of humor isn't for everyone, right? Like, you can't assume outside of maybe the more pop culture related ones like Monty Python that people actually have a familiarity or care about that type of television or humor. Um, but the plot of The Good Life is basically there's a he's like a draftsman, artist draftsman who does drawings of like little toys that will go into breakfast cereal boxes. Like that's kind of his job, and he's kind of in a dead end job. He doesn't have he doesn't take it seriously enough to progress, so he's kind of stuck in a rut. And he hits a midlife crisis. It's like his 40th birthday, and he decides that he wants to do something different, but he doesn't know what it is, and he just calls it it. It's like a thing, an urge to do something different. And then the night of his 40th birthday, he's able to define what it is, and it is the cycle of work, so you can go home and buy things and get food, and you eat the food and you use the things, so you have to go back to work, and you run that cycle over and over and over again. And he wants to break the cycle. He wants to move out of the concept of going to work because it's what he has to do. He wants to live life itself and make life itself the challenge. So in his little suburb town of Surrey, basically, or wherever it is, he takes his little suburban home and he plows up the yard and he gets chickens and pigs and goats, and he learns how to be self-sufficient. And so the entire comedy is basically he and his wife trying to navigate what it's like to be a self-sufficient family or a self-sufficient couple who've never done it before, never experienced it before. And of course they're doing it in a suburban neighborhood where all of their neighbors look at them in a strange way, basically. It says, at last, the dungeons, what wonderful cells can be made here. Was that barrel in the original plans? So I'm going to have a dungeon here. And I think this is the base of the tree. This little black piece. I'm not sure what's going to be over here, hidden away in this rock formation. But I believe this is going to do something akin to this. Might come in sideways. Yeah, I think it's going to hook in this way. So that's going to be the base of the castle, essentially. So, interesting little footprint. It's going to have the front, the gate with the portcullis and everything there. So, pretty neat. But yeah, I highly recommend that show. I actually highly recommend it just about anyone. It's one of my all-time favorite television shows, period. Not just British television, just television in general. I have probably watched through that series multiple times. But it definitely fits in with people who have an eye or an interest in self-sufficiency. The British tend to look at people who try that the way the U.S. pop culture laughs at doomsday preppers. Yeah, well, and that's kind of exactly it. Like, the show actually really champions his lifestyle. Like, it's actually kind of the point of the show. And keep in mind, it was in the 70s when you also have a bit of the hippie-ish influence everywhere, and people are trying to get back to Earth, and that kind of mentality was a thing. And yeah, they just really wanted to have, they wanted to kind of champion that lifestyle, I think. But of course make it a funny comedy. And it really is. It's got a great, obviously British dry sense of humor, but the entire cast of that show, which is primarily, it's only 4 cast members. It's the husband and the wife that are the main characters, and then their neighbors who were also former co-workers or managers in the guy's company that he quits. And it's the husband and wife, and they're very high class and hoity-toity, and they try their best to interact with that lifestyle from time to time, and it doesn't work out very well. It's just a very interesting show as well as funny, and it never looks down on those characters. Like, that's actually one of the things I appreciate about it is it. You know, if you're, you do the comparison with U.S. pop culture and Doomsday Preppers, the idea of making a comedy about Doomsday Preppers, it's going to be the punching down kind of comedy where they're trying to just make fun of the fact that someone is trying to prep, right? They're trying to be preppers. Oh, look at those fools prepping for an event that's never going to happen, right? And that's the joke. And they're all going to be, overweight redneck or white trash or that's the thing they're gonna the stereotype they're gonna try to drive for, and that's why I like The Good Neighbors or The Good Life show, because it really does basically say, like, they are much happier doing what they are doing rather than trying to do the typical suburban lifestyle, and all the challenges that come with it. The idea that, like, they go to mercantilism. They're in the middle of the capitalist boom of Britain, and the way they're going to pay for things is with selling their carrots and potatoes in a market. And they don't know how to do that because they don't have a business license, and they're trying to sell to local restaurants, and they know they can't pay the power bill, so they're going to use the waste from their pigs and goats to power a generator, basically, right? So it's all about how they're navigating all the challenges, not just of trying to be self-sufficient and work for everything they get, but also trying to do it in an environment that is not conducive to it, right? It's not a show where they went and bought, hundreds of acres in the middle of nowhere to do self-sufficiency. It's like in the middle of a suburban area, and that's part of the humor. All right, I also picked this up today. I'm going to open it. This is one of the new Lego minifigure blind bags. So I'm going to blindly open it. I have no idea what's inside of it. So I will go back here and open it up. These are fun to collect, and they're usually worth something a few years later. And it looks like I got appropriately themed a dragon of some kind. That seems interestingly themed for building a castle. Put all of this together. Ooh. If things don't change soon, late winter to spring, everyone wished they had some stored food. Yep. I've been doing more and more of that, actually, for the past couple of years. And I don't really consider myself a prepper-ish type, but I feel like I beat the clock on a few things. One is I started stocking up my pantry with both emergency food supplies and canned goods and all the rest of it, to have at least a few months for my entire family with some form of food supply and water supply. But I actually have other backups for water as well, in theory. But then I also very wisely, about 6 months before everyone was buying firearms and you couldn't get them anymore, and everything was at like a 200% markup, I wisely purchased a lot of the firearms that I had wanted, and did all those purchases and got a lot of ammo before all that became scarce. So, all right. Well, here's my Here's my dragon character, if I can get it to focus. There we go. Little dragon character. That's a pretty cool minifigure. I like it. I'll sit over here. Maybe a castle will be stormed by a person in a dragon costume. Going to see which of these figures exist and what I would want. There's actually a knight one right here that would fit with this castle. So I'll probably do a search for it. It'll likely be findable with... Probably the shield would be the easiest thing to feel for. These things have, like, you can learn how to feel for specific items. And that actually helps you discover what you're looking for easier. But the dragon is a pretty good one. That's not a bad one. I definitely would want the dragon and the knight. I'd probably want the boat captain. Beyond that, you'd just be collecting them for the sake of having the full collection. So, yeah, pretty neat. The one thing I've yet to really solve for where I live is, in terms of the prepping type thing, is trying to get to a point where I can pump water out of the creek that runs around my property in a way that is self-sustaining to an extent. And I don't know what the best way to do it is. I have looked at doing ram pumps, but I don't know the flow and the drop. It's like the flow rate and the actual drop rate of the creek is enough to be usable for that. So that's one kind of problem I have. And I could do, a powered pump, but I would want it to be something that could actually still operate off-grid, or, if power goes out, I still have the ability to get water out of the creek easily. Water and growing food. And the growing food part is, I've been building up gardening areas around my house. Got some raised beds that I have partially installed, but right when I was building all of it, both lumber and soil prices were going through the roof. Even in bulk, trying to get soil was pretty expensive. But I've been, learning some of those methods. My mother is quite the avid gardener, so I've been able to get a lot of pointers from her, growing vegetables and whatnot, and planted some fruit trees and fruit bearing plants. Mainly, we have a lot of success with one of our blueberry bushes, but blueberries, blackberries. We planted a peach tree. We're going to see how good we can do with that. But my plan for water for my garden, I actually want to do drip fed irrigation. I actually bought an ICB tote. I think it's ICB or whatever the term is. One of the big water tote things. I have one of those that I'm going to plan on building a stand for, and the idea would be pump water out of the creek into that tote and then use that tote to feed the drip fed irrigation. But I have not yet solved the problem of pumping water out of the creek. So that's the real challenge that I am faced with right now. And I've made some half-hearted attempts, I would say, at trying to solve that problem, but I haven't completely solved it. I definitely have solved the drip irrigation part. Like, I know exactly how I'm going to do that, and I'm not really worried about it. But it is just the pumping of water out of the creek is definitely difficult. And the more I've tried to look at things like ram pumps for it, the less I'm convinced that they will work. So I think my next step is going to be like trying to figure out if there is a way to, and I honestly don't know, but do solar powered based or something pumping of water that can operate, for like build up a reserve of energy and then pump for like 30 minutes a day or something, just enough to pull water up into the tote, right? And you kind of get that seeded, and then that tote will basically remain filled, essentially. That would be the concept, but I don't know if anything like that actually exists. I've done zero research on it, so haven't even done a search for it. I was trying to solve it with the ram pump, and I'm just not convinced it will. I think I need a much more fast-flowing creek. They tell you if you get 1 gallon of water per day as to survive. If you are working outside, plan on 3 to 5 per person per day. Well, and that would be another reason for wanting to have the access to the creek water, is that is at least something that you could use as freshwater drinking supply, as long as you process it or boil it or whatever. Get tablets for it. I kind of have, in my non-prepper preparation, I have the rough blueprint of how I would handle water as an issue, and it's kind of an escalation of water supply. Like, it would start with, I have basically the bagged water that comes with emergency food supply kits, which isn't really enough to drink. It's mostly only really usable for maybe some cooking, and it just isn't a lot. But I would, if needed, if I had preparation time, I would be able to actually fill up some freshwater stuff that sits in tubs, those kind of things. So I would actually be able to supply some level of freshwater, drinking water that could be utilized long enough to then move over to something that, like, processing creek water or whatever. It's one of those things where, like, you hope you never have to do any of that, because you don't really want to drink creek water. Again, I don't really consider myself a prepper, so my preparation is not as well thought out or as complex and pre-prepared as other people might have theirs. But I think it's sufficient enough that, like, I do actually have a rough blueprint for what I would do. Yeah, I can imagine, especially if you're working outside in the Georgia summers, you could easily go through 5 gallons. You'd be sweating so much all the time. Rainwater collection would work as well. My parents are actually they moved to a new house, and they're actually preparing a rainwater collection system. The shape of the roof on their house is in many ways ideally suited for some of that. And they're actually, there's like a back deck that they're going to tear up because it's terrible. And the underneath of that deck is actually prime real estate for setting up water supply stuff. So they're going to do rainwater collection, and then they're going to feed that straight to their gardening beds, which is just right next to it. So they have a really interesting, useful setup for it. But yeah, a combination of rainwater collection, having a creek near the house, that type of thing. I'm not too worried about water supply. And when we were hitting kind of drought-ish periods, I actually would go check on that creek to see, like, how much it dried up, and it didn't really. It flows fairly consistently, and much more so when it's raining heavily. But yeah, I think at this point I just need to find a way of doing pumping, either hand pumping or electric pumping. I just don't. I was hoping to do a more automated thing with a ram pump, but I'm just not convinced it's going to be possible. So it's unfortunate, because I was really hopeful. Don't forget about gray water usage. Yep. Yeah, my experience with those things is certainly minimal, but those are things that you think about and consider when camping, and I've done some of that. And water processing is something that I actually have surprisingly more knowledge and information about than I ever would have known, just from experience professionally prior to what I do these days. Having bumped elbows with people who've done water processing. And I have a friend who is formerly he's a geologist, like that's his job, or that was his degree, and he worked for watersheds in the area. So he's actually also very knowledgeable about a lot of that stuff. I should actually talk to him about some of it. Maybe he could give me some pointers. I don't know. Solar powered sump pump. That's maybe. Does that exist though? So again, I've done, when I say zero research, I mean I haven't even Google searched it. Solar power sump pump. Yeah, they're not that expensive either. Interesting. The question is, would that work well coming out of creek water where you're going to have silt and that type of thing? Like, how much damage are you going to do to a sump pump? Is your dream to get some property and build a house? Just think it can have a house which is way more energy efficient and resistant to grid problems or drought than homes. Yeah. Aaron, hey man. Aaron is actually someone I know personally, like actually have met and know. I hope things are going well for you, man. I know I've seen you on the Discord here and there. Set up a series of filters. Yeah, and that is what I would do. I guess maybe you could pre-filter the sump somehow. Like, my original plan, to give you an idea, the ram pump idea was going to have a large, called a macro filter, which is basically like a pool filter, that type of thing, to filter out leaves and sticks and that kind of stuff. That would feed into the pipes, and the pipe would go the length of the creek, but the creek bends a little bit, and it doesn't get very deep in parts. It's fast-ish flowing, but it doesn't get particularly deep in any one area. And then that would feed into the actual ram pump itself, which of course would then pump. Ram pumps basically operate off of drop distance of the water is roughly equivalent to how much you can pump upward. And I believe I could pump probably high enough if I could get it working, using a ram pump. And then the ram pump would feed through a micro filtration system that would take care of silt and sediment that would be easily cleanable before it went into the tote. And then that tote would basically be able to feed, the hopefully well filtered water to drip fed irrigation. Yeah, setting it up in Huntsville. That's great. So I not to disclose what you do, but I still assume that you are doing what you moved to go do, right? Place the pump in a box, and the box is a series of filters. Yep, that's a good idea. And if I can do it with solar powered, I probably will. It just might be an easier way of doing it. I like the idea of the ram pump because it is so low tech and so reliable. But maybe it's better to use a solar powered sump like that and then use a hand pump, just a really standard manual pump to back up if the technology ever fails. Oh, cool. Well, I'm glad things are going well for you out there. You've been out there for a couple of years now, right? I'm trying to remember. You moved out there before I had kids, so that's at least 3 years, I think. Is that correct? I don't even remember. Hand is always the backup. Manual labor is always the backup. How much vertical distance do I have between my land and the creek? So the creek is at the bottom of about, I'd call it maybe a 7-foot ravine. Moved in 2020. Okay. So yeah, my first kid was born then. The creek is at the bottom of about a 7-foot ravine in parts, and in some parts it's 6 feet. where I would have the pump situated, it's about 6 feet. The drop from where the intake would be to where the actual pump itself would be is a 2-foot drop. And the rough equivalent, as far as I'm aware, with ram pumps, and this is a ram pump thing, is that for every foot of drop, you have 7 feet of lift, roughly. So in theory, I could get a maximum of about 14 feet up. Realistically, I would only really need at most 10 feet of lift using the ram pump, if that ram pump idea would work. So all that in theory works. The question is practice. And the issue I ran into is that there were not enough deep spots of the creek to set the intake in a reliable way. And so the solution for it would be to dam up the creek, but I don't want to do that. So the better option at that point is to make a bit of a deep point closer to where I would want to pump it and use something like a solar powered sump or something like that. Yeah, moved in 2020. It seems like it was longer ago than that, I suppose, but I don't particularly remember. I know that in 2018, yeah, it was 2018 was the last time my wife and I went to Dragon Con, and I think we'd seen you there in 2018. So, well, I'm glad things are going well for you, though. It's awesome the stuff you're doing. Are you have you been able to keep up with HEMA at all out there? Is there much of an option? Yeah. I'm looking at these sump options, though. I'll have to research that. That might just be a better way of doing it. I like the idea of solar-powered things. Kind of. I'm not entirely or always convinced by the technology in some use cases, but here's a couple of pretty interesting setups. And it looks like they don't really do like a high quantity. Well, this one says 196 gallons per hour, which is actually quite a lot. With an 8-volt, 10-watt solar panel. The question is, how high can something like that pump? This is apparently designed for like fish tanks and fish ponds. So, how much lift does that have? That's going to be the type of thing I'm going to have to research, is like the lift properties of it and how high up it can go. Because the ideal would be for me to place my tote on a stand. My plan is actually to eventually build a stand that it sits on, so it has 3 to 4 feet distance off the ground, which gives it a bit more pressure to feed the irrigation line. Rocket City HEMA. That's where you set yourself up. Oh, cool. Great. So I didn't know they had a club out there, so that's great. The issue with any pumps is amperage. Yeah, the water's not moving fast enough for a turbine or water wheel approach, and there isn't a place to build anything like that, unfortunately. The ideal, given the setup, is just to do the minimal footprint and tapping off of the creek water, and it's more of a backup to utility water, essentially. Like, I'd want to be able to utilize it when I needed to, but I probably wouldn't utilize it most other times. But if I could set up something that had a rough automation, Um, I already have the setup ready to basically feed the tote, and when the tote hits an overflow point, that it then feeds back into the creek. So you would never actually have an actual overflow situation, and it would, in theory, be able to be you would just consistently run and would always work. That'd be the goal anyway. Yeah, like I said, I just need to research it. I was kind of dead set on trying to do the most mechanical, reliable, old school method I could try, and that's mostly born out of just a desire to do something I've never done before. The idea of dropping a something that is powered is just kind of like, oh, I can go get something that is powered, but to go make a system that operates as a ram pump is much more interesting, I suppose, and again, maintainable as well. Yeah, so a pump that could empty a pool. That's a good thought. Yep. Yeah, I think I'd probably set something like that up. And as long as it's solar powered, like the idea of it not having to rely on the existing grid, right? That's the end goal for a lot of my setup, is just to have an off the grid option, just in general. And I think when you look for like well pumps as well, because I see this says here's one for well irrigation, and that's it literally says filling water tanks. Perfect. That add it to wish list. That seems appropriate for what I'm looking for. This one does. I actually really enjoy the process, as it were, of prepping. Like, take the ridiculous scenario of a zombie apocalypse, or a situation that, like, the Division video game is based on, where society is collapsed and people have broken out into factions and you have to fend for yourself. Like, problem solving for that is as much a fun mental exercise as it is a potentially useful exercise. And sure, a zombie outbreak is not going to happen. But if you are preparing for it, then you are preparing for what is essentially a worst case scenario. And I find it just to be a fun mental exercise more than anything else. Like, that's what I actually most enjoy about it, is the mental exercise of it. Thinking through all the things that could go wrong, having contingency plans, applying the good old, the principles of whatever it is. If you were in the Boy Scouts, or people who've been in the military, or trying to apply survival concepts to something is fun. And it's a lot of work sometimes too, but it's enjoyable. And that mental exercise, even if you don't even execute on all of the bits and pieces of it, can still be enjoyable. So, well, I definitely got some thoughts here now. I'm gonna have to go problem solve for this sump idea, but it might work. It might be exactly what I need to do. And I would imagine that if you're buying the type that is designed for like wells, it is also going to have some concepts for particulate filtering, maybe. But this one I'm looking at has all the information you need for the pumping to the water tank from a well, like distance calculations and all that. And it honestly looks like it could be a bit of overkill for my purposes, but might be exactly what I'm looking for. And the area where I would set it up is certainly, it gets enough sunlight. So if I get the pressure right, a siphon may work. So I have looked at siphon options, but that's where the ram pump comes in. Like, that's the siphoning concept is what led me to the ram pump, because it was the most reliable and automated version of that. Wyoming, when you say like, what would you do after a hurricane, injury, job loss, etc. Yeah, no, it's definitely it's definitely where you should start. Like, yes, you should always have those things prepared. That is the purest version of preparedness, and that's fine. I mean, going beyond that to the ridiculous degree that some people go to. You know, the near conspiracy theorists, the levels that people go to that end up, you know, making them a point of mockery as opposed to someone who takes whatever the thing seriously, right? Like the ability to look at dire situations and say, how would I prepare for that dire situation? If you go for hurricanes or tornadoes, some areas earthquakes, injury, like that's the baseline. You're going to do that for pretty much everything. But then the question is, what do you do when it goes beyond that, right? So yeah, there's certainly a place to start. But I think where it gets most interesting is where it breaks beyond that. And that's where it can get fun. And you know, like hurricane, injury, job loss, all that, that leads you to like the emergency piece of that. But I also like the, how do you solve for, what if that's your lifestyle, right? Like some event happens and now you have to live life in that way. Yeah, you have more than 10 years of food in your basement for your family and grandkids. Exactly. Like, I don't have 10 years of food, mostly because I don't have space for that amount of food in my house. But my, you know, my level of preparedness is certainly different. Yeah, I don't know. I find it a fascinating mental exercise at the very least. Certainly, like I have food stores. I have things that I would need. I have plans for various situations. But yeah, it's really a question of like how would you get back to off the land subsistence if you needed to long term. One of the things I actually did back in 2020, and I'd actually started getting stuff together for it at the end of 2019, but it happened to coincide with the start of the pandemic, that I was building a cyber deck, which I originally saw it kind of hit a lot of tech articles, and then I was like, so like I was enthralled with the idea of building my own, so I went and I did it, and I built a cyber deck. You know, runs on a Raspberry Pi, runs a Linux, a Debian distro on a Raspberry Pi, and it's loaded up with knowledge bases and survival materials and all that type of stuff, both as a reference as well as like a just general resource. It has like all of the Project Gutenberg library installed on it. It has GPS and mapping software installed on it. Basically anything and everything I could put on it that I could find. And the idea is that, you know, you have that stored away and then it's just usable when you need it. And I actually did videos on it on a different channel, not my normal channel. Let me go. So I can pull this up on the stream. I did post a little article on it at one point. There we go. So I themed it after the Division. So that's my little cyber deck. You know, full functional keyboard. Can I zoom in? So, um, I placed a couple things in there with the idea that I might go back and do various other things like software defined radio and all that. But it's got USB ports, Ethernet ports. It has an onboard switch so you can connect other computers to it. It has various switches for whether or not you're using external or internal battery supply, with the ability to turn off things like the display, or the network switch, so you kind of have the ability to toggle between what is using up your battery power. Everything is using USB as a standard because for a couple reasons. One is the USB standard is actually really a quite good standard. Like most things are 5 volts. Most USB cables operate off of a fairly simple pinout style, and like actually dissecting the cables is very easy. I had thought about doing it with a jack, a standard barrel jack, but the funny thing is that barrel jacks aren't very standard, and so the USB standard. Part of my thought was you could actually scrounge USB supplies easier these days from just about anywhere than you could actual electronic supplies. Like, I could go to any gutted gas station and probably find a USB cable somewhere. You can't do the same thing with a certain type of barrel jack, right? So I use USB for that reason. And then this article talks a bit about, so that there was the original one was Jay Dosher here, who did this this cyber deck. Where's his pictures? Weird. He has no pictures anymore. Oh, there it goes. So he kind of showed his process, what he built. And I utilized a lot of what he did, but not all of what he did. You can see like his base plate is a little bit different than mine, or his face plate. I used his multi-switch idea. I thought it was a good idea. He used a barrel jack for his power input, but again, I wanted to go with something that I thought would be a little bit easier to scrounge. His wiring was serviceable, but I actually took what I believe is a slightly better approach. So yeah, I got the idea from him. I made a little box for it to go in. It's a copper lined box that in theory can act as a bit of a Faraday cage. I have a tray where you can set your power input cable, your power supply, an external USB, a GPS device, all these little things you can put in storage so you can control, set the whole thing up. The lettering on the faceplate is done with glow-in-the-dark filament. So the whole faceplate was, a lot of the elements are actually 3D printed. But the faceplate, I printed the text, the font, with glow-in-the-dark filament. So if you need to like do something with it when it's completely dark out, you can actually kind of see. And then the actual software on it, again, I have mapping software, all with downloaded offline versions of maps. And for major cities and for most of the area near where I live, it's high quality, high detail map and satellite imagery. And I have a knowledge base that comes from all sorts of places, including tons of doomsday prepper groups and whatnot. And then I have all of Wikipedia, all of ArchWiki, all of the Raspberry Pi Stack Exchange, all of Wikivoyage, gardening and landscape information, Project Gutenberg, all is installed on it, so it's all referenceable. Don't need an internet connection for any of it. Yeah, it was a fun project, and the idea is basically you have a plan in a box, as it were, right? You even something as bad as a solar flare, in theory, could allow you to. This would still allow you to do something beyond just being like, well, I'm screwed, right? And it was a really fun project. It was it was multiple months of building it and kind of getting things prepared for it, getting all the stuff I needed, getting it customized my own way. And so it's a bit of a useful thing as well as like I wanted to have a certain style. And then I actually built a micro version of it. There is a thing called a therm case, which looks like, see if I can find it. Here we go. One of these. And the idea is it's basically a case that fits into a fairly standard MOLLE system, and you can hook it onto a backpack or on a chest plate or something like that. And what I did for that was I have a solar powered battery, pretty standard USB style battery pack for like phones, but it is solar powered. And so you could open up the case and charge it in the sunlight. And then I have a phone, basically a cheap phone. Because one of the great things about phones is they're relatively cheap hardware and relatively customizable if you know what you're doing. And so I installed the phone and the solar power thing. The ideal would be to have the solar panel on the outside, but if you do that, then you're kind of compromising the purpose of this case, which is to be completely waterproof and dustproof and all the rest of it. So you could like submerge this thing in water, and as long as you're not opening it up, everything inside stays dry and good. And it has like the mapping software installed on it, and because it's a phone, because it's an Android phone, I could actually install ATAC on it. So much better mapping and beyond mapping software. And then the one thing that I never got around to doing was installing all the knowledge base stuff on it. So I kind of had like conceptually two versions of the same thing. And most of that's just, at that point, it's not even about trying to be a serious prepper or anything like that. It's really just like, I want to screw around and make something fun that might still be useful past being fun. So that is certainly one of the... I like making things. I like solving those problems. A little bit of that engineer at heart part of me. I could probably find photos somewhere of this case. Let's see. That would have been 2020. Ish. That I would have made that case. So I'll start there and I'll start scrolling up and see if I can't find my therm case. Go through my old photos of all this stuff. I think I did it after my second child was born. So go look. Doom scrolling through photos is what I'm doing right now. So many photos, mostly of children. But what's really fun about either of these projects was I kind of get to do everything, right? Like sit down with calipers and what's essentially not really CAD software, but 3D modeling software. I actually use Blender because I have a lot of familiarity with Blender, but kind of going through the engineering challenge of actually making, putting all the components together that would allow me to fit everything into a small case, whether it's that Pelican case or the Therm case. Being able to take all those components, get them in a compact space, put it all together, and then flex a little bit of the electrician in me or the small wiring jobs and actually figure out how to supply power to everything and do that in a good way. Here we go. So let me do a screen share of this. This is the Therm case version I did. And so you get a little bit of the CAD stuff. You get some of the small electrical work, fine electrical circuitry stuff. You get to mess around with software. Like, you kind of get to do a little bit of everything. And that's where it can be a lot of fun. So here you go. Let's go through the pictures. So I received this as like a gift. This very, very thin, flat USB external battery pack. And so it actually fit in this therm case pretty well. And I made 2 face plates that would fit on either side of the therm case with space for wiring. So all of this was designed by me. I sat down with, again, calipers and blender and figured out all the shapes and the way I would need to fit everything. There's the phone I used. I think it's a A50 phone. Have a little toggle button that was used. Basically allows me to toggle on and off the battery power supply. So the phone isn't constantly pulling power off of the external battery. But when at a push of a button, it will charge it. There it is sitting next to my other one. And so what you have here is this little wire right here goes from battery pack to phone with a button up here that when you press the button, it starts to charge. And then this little hole right here is where you can plug external power into the battery pack. So if you're not trying to charge the whole setup via solar, you can charge it off of an actual electrical supply using I actually used one of the little magnetic ends. I don't know if I have a picture of that. Yeah, there we go. So you have little magnetic clip type ends. And so you could use that to plug in and get power in there. So worst case scenario, you're using solar power and you're having to wait some number of hours to days for the thing to charge enough to charge a phone. But then the actual kit itself is, well, easy to charge. And it fits all in this little case that can sit on a backpack like that. And has, I would say currently it has, 200% of the functionality of mapping software because I get to use ATAC for it, and about 50% the usefulness of the knowledge base stuff, because the knowledge base stuff I have not transferred over to it yet, but I will eventually. So these are fun projects I do. These are the types of random things I'll do from time to time. And I have done videos on them, and I might actually go back and repurpose the videos and pull them into the current channel and merge everything. So I might do that at some point. I don't know. For self-sustaining ideas, look at Earthships. I will do that. Well, anyway, those are the weird random things that I have done with my time here and there. Hopefully that's at least somewhat interesting. And getting close to the point where I need to get off and get ready for bed. So while I drink a caffeinated soda, that's a bad idea. Yeah, I appreciate the ideas. I'm gonna look into the water pump ideas at this point. And good catching up with you, Aaron, and good talking to you, Wyoming. It's been a good night. I appreciate it. I guess I'll talk to everyone later.